You're watching The Legal Breakdown. Glenn, a few days ago, we spoke about the impending effort by Ghislaine Maxwell, who is Jeffrey Epstein's associate, to have the DOJ review her case. Now, yesterday was the last day, the deadline for the DOJ to be able to do this. Can you explain what happened in this effort?
Yeah, Brian. So Jeffrey Epstein's convicted co-conspirator, Ghislaine Maxwell, went to trial, was convicted, sentenced to 20 years, filed an appeal. The appellate court affirmed the conviction, rejected her appeal, and then she asked the Supreme Court to take her case up, let her argue that her conviction should be overturned. Interestingly, the Trump administration, the Solicitor General's office, asked the Supreme Court for a couple of extensions because apparently they weren't quite ready to take a position, a little bit curious. Maybe they were just really overworked, but they finally filed their reply to Maxwell's request that the Supreme Court take up her case, and they are now on record as saying the Supreme Court should not review her case. So inferentially, they believe her conviction and her 20-year sentence should stand. So now we have to wait to see what the Supreme Court does. Will they accept the case for review over the Department of Justice's objection, or will they just wash their hands of it, refuse to accept the case, and that will pretty much be the end of the legal proceedings unless Donald Trump's DOJ decides to somehow intervene in her case legally in the future. And this old prosecutor can envision a couple of ways they would be really unusual, but a couple of ways that DOJ might be able to do that.
Now, I want to dig into exactly that, but I have a question that's burning right now that I want to ask first, and then you can go right into that part. But is there any way that some of the information that we're getting from the Trump administration now might have an impact on her ability to litigate this case? And specifically what I'm asking about is, the Justice Department is saying that there's no client list. And so if there's no clients, then what, the argument that you hear even from these Trump supporters, if there are no clients, then how do you get the pimp, so to speak, Ghislaine Maxwell? What has she done? Because the administration refuses to even say that there were any clients available. And so can she come forward and say, hey, this administration is saying that there are no clients here, and so what am I doing here? Is that something that she could put forward as some defense?
Brian, you're beginning to sound like an experienced criminal defense attorney because, in fact, if now the Trump administration, Pam Bondi and her Department of Justice are making claims like not only there's no client list, but I actually heard some account, I don't know if it was from a reliable source or not, that what the Trump administration or Trump surrogates are floating was Obama made this whole thing up. Well, wait a minute. Your Department of Justice took her to trial and convicted her of significant crimes committed in concert with Jeffrey Epstein, and now you're saying it was all a fabrication? If she has an enterprising legal team, and I'm sure she does, she could file a motion based on what's called newly discovered evidence. All of a sudden, the Trump administration is saying this whole thing was some kind of a political inside job, a fabrication, and yet they introduced evidence and a jury convicted her based on what? Evidence you're now claiming is fabricated. Now,
right.
Now, mind you, Brian, I am extremely skeptical of anything that tumbles out of, Donald Trump or Pam Bondi's mouth about the Epstein matter, because it all seems to be really just for the court of public opinion at this point. But to answer your question directly, anything that Pam Bondi, for example, represents is or is not evidence in the Epstein matter could absolutely be used by her attorneys to try to get a court to reopen her case and maybe give it another look.
Okay, so now I want to go back to what you were saying before. You had given some options in terms of the ways that the DOJ could intervene that are probably a little bit more unorthodox than what we would normally expect.
Yeah, so here are some of the things that I've been thinking about that the Trump administration could consider. Of course, one is a pardon, a presidential pardon. Let's assume, and all of this is hypothetical, let's assume Maxwell is contemplating talking to a reporter, talking to an investigative journalist about, for example, the Epstein client list or other matters that, might be of searing public interest to people. Donald Trump and his DOJ could swoop in and say, you know what? If you remain, quiet, if you don't give media interviews about all this, we'll pardon you. Now, Brian, that would be a pretty unsavory deal to strike, using a pardon to buy somebody's silence because you don't want it to hurt you politically. But presidential pardons have wide berth, according to this Supreme Court, and Donald Trump can wield them in pretty much any way he wants. There are other legal vehicles, like a Rule 35 motion to reduce somebody's sentence in the event that, let's assume that a witness who has been convicted at trial, sentenced, and exhausted all of his or her appeals. After all that, they come forward, they say, you know what? I can give you the shooter on the grassy knoll. I have some really blockbuster evidence about the crimes of others, but I'm sitting here doing a 20-year sentence. So if you want the information I have and I'm willing to testify about it, you're going to have to do something for me, and that could look like a Rule 35 reduction in somebody's sentence, filing a motion to reduce a sentence. So there are ways. I'm not saying that the Trump administration or Pam Bondi would be interested in striking that kind of a deal with a Maxwell. But, there are still avenues, even after all appeals are exhausted, there are still avenues where the Department of Justice can insert itself and still have an impact on the sentence somebody is serving.
The reality is that even if the administration is not coming out right now and saying that they've struck up some deal to keep Maxwell quiet, because maybe she does have damaging information, maybe she has information that's damaging to Donald Trump himself or somebody in his administration, and logic would lend itself to that, because why else would Trump, who is in an administration where so many people have staked their brands, staked their reputations on exposing this information, people like Dan Bongino, Kash Patel, Pam Bondi, Alina Habba. So logic would lend itself to this reason that clearly somebody doesn't want this information to come out, because they themselves were the ones that promised all of this explosive information before suddenly they shut up and pretended that they didn't. And so in that scenario where the DOJ did kind of strike up some quiet deal behind the scenes, isn't it true that the reality is we wouldn't even know it because the DOJ doesn't have to release any of this stuff? And so we might be in a situation right now where the Justice Department may have said, okay, Ghislaine Maxwell, your job is to keep quiet until January 21st, 2029, and then you'll be, released from prison. That kind of stuff wouldn't have to be disclosed, would it?
No, it wouldn't. And if we go back to pardons for a minute, there is no legal requirement that a pardon be made public in order for it to be a legitimately delivered pardon. It could be done behind the scenes. It could be done privately. And as you say, Brian, a pardon could become effective the moment a president left office or just before he left office, and we would have no way of knowing about it except when Maxwell walked out of prison.
Right. I think by that point, it would become pretty clear.
3 years on a 20-year sentence. I think that would give us a clue that, something was up.
Yeah. Well, I think it's worth asking, too. We've been talking about this, and I almost say this all tongue-in-cheek because I think you and I both agree that this woman did commit horrific crimes. And so the goal here is not to try and run cover for Ghislaine Maxwell. The goal is to try to point out the flaw in the Justice Department and the Trump administration's argument that if they are going to come out and say that the whole saga, the whole Epstein list, the whole file is the result of some fabrication by Barack Obama and Joe Biden, then their own argument begins to tumble. And so they're put between a rock and a hard place where, okay, if they're going to pretend that it's fake, then the prosecutions that are built on that also don't have a leg to stand on, and so those kind of fall beneath the weight of their own fragility. And so, which one is it? Are you going to pretend that there's no legitimate Epstein files, and then now you've got to be the person to litigate this new case against Ghislaine Maxwell, this new update where she says, okay, well, if this is all a fabrication of the Democrats, then why am I in here? And now they're in a whole world of hurt because they have to choose between substantiating what Donald Trump said to save his own ass or to save his donor's ass, whoever he's protecting, or they have to figure out, what to do about Ghislaine Maxwell, whose further confinement relies on them actually telling the truth about all this. So either way, they've kind of backed themselves into a corner here.
Yeah, Brian, anybody who wants to credit this nonsense about, the whole Jeffrey Epstein thing being a political fabrication by, Barack Obama or other nefarious political actors. Jeffrey Epstein was convicted and served a sentence in Florida, albeit in a state case. Jeffrey Epstein was indicted by a federal grand jury and was pending trial in federal court when he, I'm going to use the word, died in that
right.
jail cell, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that dog won't hunt that this thing was some political orchestration. It was all made up. It was fabricated. Of course it wasn't. So it seems to me that Maxwell probably has lots and lots of receipts to provide about what exactly Jeffrey Epstein was doing and who he was doing it with or who he was doing it for. And that's the kind of thing that it sure seems like Pam Bondi and the Trump administration right now are desperate to keep from going public.
All right, Glenn, I have a burning question here, and that is, you had alluded to the fact that Jeffrey Epstein, we'll say, died. There is some concern that Ghislaine Maxwell might also die. And so in the Bureau of Prisons, in this legal world, which is, very opaque for somebody like me, and I'm sure most of the audience who's watching now, but not for you. I mean, you had a long 30-year career as a federal prosecutor. And so with all of this attention on somebody like Ghislaine Maxwell, how do we ensure that she doesn't die in very much the same way that Jeffrey Epstein did?
Brian, I dealt with not only people dying in prison, I dealt with people being murdered in prison and then trying to prove a murder case when your witnesses may very well be other inmates or corrections officers can be a pretty challenging proposition. We have people who commit suicide. I had a defendant who killed himself before he went to trial. So these things happen. But most prison systems have a pretty good surveillance operation where, they are surveilling, they are watching in real time everything that's going on in pretty much every nook and cranny of the confinement facility to guard against this very thing. Unfortunately, people get shanked all the time. Fights break out. And people get stabbed, people get bludgeoned. It happens, and ordinarily the folks who run the correctional facility, the detention facility, want to be on top of those incidents in real time. So, hopefully the same fate does not befall Maxwell that befell Epstein, whatever that fate may be. I know there are different schools of thought about what happened. I tried to closely scrutinize every photograph that was made publicly available, together with autopsy reports that were made publicly available. And I will say, given the 22 of my 30 years as a prosecutor, I was working murder cases in the courts of Washington, D.C. I found a lot of that evidence very curious.
Yeah. All right. Well, obviously, a lot to stay on top of here, and this case is moving pretty quickly, so we'll see if we have any update on the legal front as far as Ghislaine Maxwell is concerned, on the political front as far as Donald Trump and his insistence that, in fact, the very file that most of his cabinet ran on is now somehow a fabrication at the hands of Barack Obama and Joe Biden, who were also not in office when Jeffrey Epstein was prosecuted or died in 2019, because that would also be Donald Trump, but, minor details. So anyway, for those who are watching right now, if you'd like to stay on top of this stuff, please make sure to subscribe. It's the best way to support our work, and it is completely free. I'll put the links to both of our channels right here on this screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.